Well, since Korea has seen the whole change in the into the new president, of course, we've been very much criticized recently by Korean media, saying that even though we are making such a desperate efforts to improve the bilateral relationship, why don't you do exactly the same thing? But well, basically, I think still Japan has been very much positive than before. But still, there is a kind of lots of reservations about the again the future change. Korea's politics is almost like a rolling coaster. It's just going to the peak and then just suddenly to start fall, and it's very scary for a Japanese point of view, and it looks very inconsistent all the time. So Koreans say that's a dynamic Korea, and Japanese say that's an inconsistent Korea. So that's the problems between the two. And so what's very much worried on the Japanese side is that we've been very much welcoming the Koreans' new president message, saying that we would never utilize the emotional, anti-Japan emotional things for domestic politics. So we tried to separate it, and that was very much welcome. So, we've been trying to do something on it positively, but still, there is another divisions. Japan is not divided unlike Korea. Well, still, from Japanese point of view, Korea is so much divided in Team A and Team B. And now the administrations changed from Team B to Team A. But we tend to think that we are not so much divided. But recently, I've appeared in one TV program, and I noticed that Japan is also very much divided. Why? Because the topic of the program was maybe Korean economy is surpassing the Japanese economy. And when we do that, there was an emotional backlash coming out of the super conservative people. And that's a Team A. And Team B, usually from women's or younger generations, they are more practical and they are more realistic. I should say that, oh, some Koreans are doing much better than us. Why don't we learn from them, and why don't we have a partnership with them? What's wrong about it? So usually it is the relatively old man who's isolated in the house. They tend to be team A because they never like the Korean dramas, etc. So, but that's why. So I know that there's Team A and Team B, even in Japan. So it's not that extreme like in Korea, because we are not there such a divided country. The security issues never exist in Japan. So, but still, there's emotionally Team A, nationalistic guys, and Team B. So we have to work on each side to persuade the different opinions, because we are a democratic system. So we cannot make a propaganda that you are totally wrong, you should follow us. We cannot do that. So I think that's the positions where we are. And the reasons why I've been cautiously optimistic about the relations is I'm economist by training, and in business society, actually, business society is perfectly Team B. So it's a win-win kind of society. So if Korea is doing better and they are purchasing our products, so we are very happy about it. Why don't we have a better partnership? But the politics is a zero-sum game. So if somebody wins, somebody is going to lose. So that's the difference.
In the United States, Team A really wants an improvement in Korea-Japan relations. And Team B really wants an improvement in Korea-Japan relations. And it's pretty much the same here in Australia, where I have been for the past month. I've been struck how many senior political figures and officials in Australia worry about Korea-Japan relations, just as we do in the United States. And the reason is because in the overall stability of not only Northeast Asia, but the Indo-Pacific more broadly, this relationship is really critical. And at a time of growing geopolitical competition, we need a stable and productive relationship between Seoul and Tokyo. Part of that is history. Um, Most of the major wars in East Asia had their origins in competition for the Korean Peninsula, usually because of a shift in the balance of power among the major powers. The Injin War came after the decline of the Min Empire and the consolidation of Japan under Hideyoshi. The Sino-Japanese War came with the collapse of Qing power and the rise of Japan. The Russo-Japanese War followed that. The Korean War, the Cold War, was the result of the vacuum on the Korean Peninsula caused by the collapse of Japan's empire and the major powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, China, competing for control of the Korean Peninsula, which is critical real estate, critical geographic center of influence in Northeast Asia. And we have right now that geopolitical competition, a shift in balance of power, like we had before the Indian War, the Sino-Japanese War, the Korean War. And often in those previous conflicts, Korea's choices intensified the geopolitical rivalry of the big powers. And over the previous few years under the Moon administration, I was actually quite worried that Korea's choices were exacerbating, were making worse the geopolitical tensions. I don't think that's how the Blue House perceived things. The Blue House is trying to avoid making geopolitical competition worse, trying to adhere to a kind of strategic ambiguity and avoid choosing sides. But the problem with that approach was that in Tokyo, it was viewed with deep suspicion that somehow Korea was going over to China's sphere of influence. And I think in Beijing, it was viewed as an opportunity. The 3-no decision over THAAD, strategic ambiguity, this excited Chinese ambition. I have been involved in and out of government for 25 years in strategic dialogues with Chinese scholars and think tank experts about the future of Asia. And they very often describe a future of Asia where the Korean Peninsula falls under China's influence, because in Beijing, many scholars see that as a natural historic state of affairs. And I don't think that's how the vast majority of Korean thinkers view their future, but the signal sent on the 3 no's of THAAD, strategic ambiguity, those signals, I think to many in China look like an invitation to be more ambitious about Chinese hegemonic ambitions. And of course, this matters a lot to the United States, which wants stability and wants to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, as Abe-san first called it. But it also matters to the United States and, of course, to Japan and Korea because of the North Korea challenge. The U.S. Command, the Combined Forces Command, would have a much more difficult time responding to North Korea aggression if we're not able to work and operate smoothly with Japan. So in terms of defense and deterrence, it's critical, but also diplomatically, the rift between Tokyo and Seoul weakens Korean, American, and Japanese leverage diplomatically. It takes pressure off of China. It takes pressure off of North Korea. So it matters in those terms. We all know pretty well the proximate causes of the bilateral tensions in the court cases and in politics, and we know the longer historical challenges. I thought it's worth considering briefly some of the structural and ideational problems that are making reconciliation difficult. In terms of geopolitics, I think this is a major problem. It's changing, as Professor Son mentioned, it's changing, but I think Korean and Japanese views of the international order in Asia are both very much alike and very different. They're very much alike, as Professor Son said, because Korean and Japanese elites and the Korean and Japanese public see democratic norms, rule of law, and a strong American alliance as critical. In most polls, about 90% of Japanese and Koreans favor alliance with the US. And when we've done surveys at CSIS on democratic norms in 10 to 15 countries in Asia, the 2 countries that most closely align in their views of democracy are not the US and Australia or Japan and Australia, it's actually Korea and Japan. So there's remarkable synergy in views of geopolitics and democratic norms. But if you look at the polls and if you read the scholarship in Tokyo and Seoul, in Korea and Japan, with the rise of Chinese power, Korean scholars have tended to emphasize the emergence of a bipolar structure, of a Sino-US structure in Asia, and that Korea has to choose how to navigate that. Whereas Japanese writers and Abe's own strategy tend to emphasize not a bipolar, but a multipolar system, where a country like Japan has agency, and Japan can shape the balance of power through things like the Quad with India and Australia and the US. So very different assumptions about the nature of the distribution of power and the ability of Korea or Japan to handle things. We've also found in polls at CSIS, frankly, that Korean experts have much more confidence in the US than Japanese experts. My view of Abe's strategy is he strengthened the US-Japan alliance, not because he was sentimental or confident in the US, because he was worried about Obama and especially Trump. Whereas polls and scholarship in Korea, to me, show pretty clearly our Korean friends have much more confidence in us and think the US can manage a bipolar competition with China. I don't think Japanese experts have the same confidence in the US and therefore want to shape the environment by doing things like the Quad, by doing things like stepping up and doing more on defense with the United States. I think that the Japanese strategic experts view Korea's strategic ambiguity as bandwagoning with China. I think many Korean experts have seen Japan's efforts at counterbalancing and forming the Quad as provoking China. And so the geopolitics and how both countries are interpreting their agency, their options, quite different. But the root interests of Japan and Korea are closer than almost any two countries in Asia around alliances, rule of law, and democratic norms. The other thing I'd say is that ideationally, and I'll end with this, democracy matters a lot to Korea and Japan. And I study this a lot and talk to colleagues in both countries and around the region. Democracy matters a lot. But what democracy means at this stage of Korean political development and Japanese political development is different in interesting ways. My sense is that for Korea, at least for many Koreans, democracy now is about accountability. And a lot of the historical problems of Japan are about leaders in Korean politics and law trying to hold the conservative governments in the past and therefore Japan accountable. And that is where Korean democracy is now. Whereas I think in Japan, democracy and democratic norms are viewed as a necessary thing to protect and defend against Chinese coercion and Chinese revisionism. And the Korean view of Japan's democracy and the Japanese view of Korean democracy are different. And I think that in Tokyo, and Fukukawa-san can speak to this, but I think in Tokyo, when Korean governments and officials bring up the past, it's seen as playing into China's narrative by focusing on grievances and not democratic norms. But I think from the Korean perspective, when Japan has been unwilling, and Japanese political leaders have been unwilling to engage in a fuller discussion on the past, it's seen as obstructing Korea's democratic evolution and Korea's effort to have accountability. So these are to me, from an American perspective, complicated obstacles, but fundamentally it's not about divergent interests or divergent values.